Sri Aurobindo has brought the discussion now to a fundamental problem of life and of our existence. And that is, what is it that we are in our experience as a soul, and what is its relationship with what is in our experience, nature. And so the whole chapter is titled The Soul and Nature. Since we are resuming after a gap of more than a month, it will be useful to recall what is the context for this discussion. You will remember in the previous chapter titled Oneness, Sri Aurobindo had described how our experience of Satchidananda has to take on the practical form of experiencing the oneness of the divine in all the levels of our consciousness and in all the activities of our being. And the result of this integral knowledge is to gather all the different strands of our being into the universal oneness. The whole universe is one, we also, and all our relationships with all things are experienced in the oneness. But the full possession of the world from this divinized consciousness can only be had if we know everything in its absoluteness. It's not enough to say that there is a flower and I feel an experience of oneness with it. Do I know flower for its absoluteness of its divine essence? As long as we are still seeing things in parts, we belong to a lower knowledge. And to see things as the divine sees them is to see from the higher knowledge, in which, he says, the absolute is everywhere. Can we see and experience the absolute in the flower and in all things? If we have not come to that, then our possession of the world in this divinized consciousness is not yet complete. Second, he says, every finite is an infinite and has to be known and sensed in its intrinsic infiniteness as well as in its surface finite appearance. So take any object which is finite, as all things in the universe are, and yet he says it is an infinite. We can only see the finite appearance. Can we experience its infiniteness also? And if we cannot, then our possession of the world in the divinized consciousness is not yet complete. We should be able to not only experience that infinity of all things, but also know its finite appearance so that you can relate to it in its surfaces as necessary. You have the famous incident of the disciple who is given by the Guru a premature awakening of the Brahman consciousness, and he is overwhelmed by this oneness or infinity of the Brahman consciousness, and he runs around shouting, everything is Brahman. And as he ends up on the road, there is an elephant approaching, and he starts shouting, elephant, you are Brahman, I am Brahman, world is Brahman. And the Mahout says, hey crazy fellow, get away from me. And the fellow says, no, you don't understand, you are Brahman, I am Brahman. And so the Mahout nudges the elephant, and the elephant picks up the disciple and throws him. Bruised and in pain, he goes back to his Guru and says, but I thought everything is Brahman, how did this happen? And the Guru says to him, well, there is also elephant Brahman and Mahout Brahman, and you should be able to relate to them in their own finite appearances also. So Sri Aurobindo very carefully formulates these words. Every finite is an infinite and has to be known and sensed in its intrinsic infiniteness as well as its surface finite appearance. And only when you have the full spectrum of its reality that you can relate to it perfectly as necessary on all levels. And why is this important? When this experience is complete, he says at that point, we have a divine vision, divine sense, divine ecstasy in the experience of union of ourselves with the objects of our consciousness. And the result of that is each thing becomes to us our self, God, the absolute and infinite Satchidananda. The benefit of this completeness is that you have the secret of complete delight in God's world, complete satisfaction of the mind and heart and will, complete liberation of the consciousness. And now everything is complete, including the satisfaction and the participation and enjoyment of the world. Anything less is incomplete. And this, Sri Aurobindo says, is the secret of that complete delight and satisfaction. It is the supreme experience also to which art and poetry and all the various efforts of knowledge and desire to possess and enjoy objects is secretly trying to arrive. And so here Sri Aurobindo puts this, what we would consider now as a high or complete experience of the divine, in the context of all the existing efforts to grow in knowledge and in possession and enjoyment of the world. What do you do with art and poetry? You are trying to glimpse something beautiful or an aspect of enjoyment, greater or lesser, and trying to give it an expression. The attempt essentially is to be able to enjoy, to possess, and to know more deeply everything. And so all these efforts, however rudimentary, however crude, are pointing towards this experience. And what he's saying is, when we approach this experience, all of art, all of poetry, all attempts to know, to desire, to possess, to enjoy, are fulfilled in this. This is so important because in the way the human being is formed, we are always dissatisfied with anything which falls short. I enjoy this, I enjoy more, but if only I could enjoy completely and perfectly. And anything that falls short leaves a gap of something possible but unreachable, leading to a frustration or dissatisfaction. And there is such a thing possible that you can have the most complete, not the most, the complete experience of delight in God's world, complete satisfaction of mind, heart and will, at the same time being in a complete liberation of consciousness. And it will fulfill all these efforts of the human struggle, including all the art and poetry and attempts to know and seize and experience the world. Now, you see how important this experience is and how it relates to the current human effort. If you look at the big picture, what is obvious is every effort at art and poetry, every effort to know, to grow, to be able to master your circumstances, to be able to better enjoy your world, every effort is pointing towards this. In other words, no effort is fulfilled unless it reaches this eventually. Think of it this way, unknowingly, everybody in the world is struggling to realize this. Unknowingly, therefore, everybody will eventually approach this. The difference only is whether you do it consciously or unconsciously. And this is the ultimate, the acme of the satisfaction that is intended for us. The absolute satisfaction and sense of illumination which it gives and alone can give is proof of its validity, he says. We get by that a ray from the higher consciousness and the divine sense into which our subjective being is intended eventually to be transfigured, if we will only allow it. So eventually all of this movement of human struggle is meant to reach this, if only we will allow it. Meaning somewhere inside, we are unintentionally preventing this from happening. And why? How does that happen? And we have only to see how our tendency to act, to know, is always limited by our innate insecurity, sense of separateness and narrowness. Because we are separate, because we are narrow, we fear crossing a line, a boundary, to reach out. And if something goes too close, something else shrinks back, pulls you back from being too close to a deeper or higher awakening. This has now to be fulfilled. How are we to fulfill? This is going to be the theme of the next few chapters. First of all, he says, already in the previous discussion, at the highest level of the absolute of the divine consciousness, yes, this is already known to us, everything is absolute and infinite. But then can we experience that truth in all of the lower or partial workings? Particularly, he says, every principle of the absolute in activity should be able to experience this underlying infinity and absoluteness in itself and in everything. If all the basic principles can be awakened to this underlying truth, then everything else will happen automatically. Sri Aurobindo always goes to the essential, shortest, briefest, most direct way to attain to things. Of these principles, therefore, he picks up the first of these principles in importance, and that is the principle of duality. Everything in all the cosmos is found to be of a dual nature. And if in this duality you can discover this absolute of the divine, this infinity of the divine, then already a huge work is done. Then he will take up other secondary principles, and in each of those also he will show how this can be done. And so this begins the discussion of the chapter proper. What is this duality of Purusha and Prakriti, which has been in the earlier part of the synthesis of yoga, has been touched upon. We have not really studied it in our classes, but we are all familiar with the concept. There is a status of consciousness which is observer, and then there is this movement of nature, and there are two. He shows you the various philosophical perspectives of this. You can see the two as self and Maya, and interpret the two, self and Maya, in two different ways. Maya as the power of the self to delude itself, or Maya as the creative power of the self, depending on the traditions. You can see them also as the Lord and his creative cosmic power. And all of these are various ways of looking at it. But he says, we must go back to the experience rather than the philosophical formulation of it. We have to go back to the experience, and in the experience we find the original psychological experience from which all these philosophies take their start, that there are two elements in the existence of living beings. Anything that's living has two elements. Of human beings at least, if not of all cosmos. So he's throwing as an aside, even if you claim that it is only in human beings and not in animals or other living beings, not in plants perhaps, at least you know it is true in human beings. But on the other extreme, it could also be everywhere in the cosmos. He leaves you that suggestion. It's not central to the discussion, but the answer to that suggestion will also be found when we find the answer to this question within the human being. So what are we? A dual being, nature and soul. What does it mean? And we start now a subjective process, an introspection where we will begin to observe what this experience is about, what is our relationship of this soul and nature internally, and then what does it lead to as a discovery, and subsequently what can we do to make that relationship, well, complete or true in what it should be. So he starts with, this duality is self-evident. As we are, as human beings, we can experience it without needing anyone to show us anything. Without any philosophy at all, by the mere force of experience, it is what we can all perceive, although we may not take the trouble to define. In practice, it takes this form. I want to do, but I'm too tired. And we experience two layers. One which wants, and one which refuses or cannot. What are these? Now he says, we don't take the trouble to define. But in the experience, we're experiencing this double term. I am so happy, but something. I am sad, but always there is something else which is a but against my internal awareness, which I am conscious of. Even within my awareness, I can begin to find a further refinement of the duality. I am happy or I am sad, but I don't want to be sad. Interesting. I am able to separate from what I thought was me and take a stance which is further behind. I don't want to be sad, but I am unable to get free of the sadness. Who is the person that does not want to be sad? Who is the person struggling against that which prevents it? What is the thing which prevents it from being free of the sadness? I'm feeling depressed. I don't want to be depressed, but I'm unable to pull myself out. What is this I that feels it can be free? It knows it can be free, knows it has the right to be free, and is struggling to pull itself out. And from what is it trying to pull itself out? What is it in that which binds it, compels it, prevents it from being free? And there is always this double awareness. Even in my more refined parts, I can stand back and observe that there is a part of my awareness which is actually free, while another part which is struggling. So I'm struggling to be free of my sadness, but there is a part in me that observes the struggle to be free. And if I'm very careful, I notice this part is already free. Interesting. And so we discover an ability to be able to separate out in layers and layers, but eventually coming to some kind of an essential awareness. So even the most thoroughgoing materialism which denies the soul or resolves it into a more or less illusory result of natural phenomena acting upon some ill-explained phenomenon of the physical brain, which we call consciousness or the mind, but which is really no more than a sort of complexity of nervous spasms, cannot get rid of the practical fact of this duality. Now we can take the most extreme materialist position, and even then we will not be able to get free of this practical duality. And what is the most extreme position? The materialism which denies soul or resolves it into a more or less illusory result of natural phenomena acting upon some ill-explained phenomenon of the physical brain, which we call consciousness or mind. What is soul? It is just your experience of consciousness or your experience of mind. And how is that coming? There is something happening in the natural processes by which this appears. How does it appear? Where does it appear? Why doesn't it appear everywhere? Well, it's happening somewhere inside your brain, and somehow the physical brain has this ability to produce the experience of mind or of consciousness, and that's what you call yourself or your soul. What in the physical brain is able to produce this, which we do not find anywhere else? We do not experience it in the head, for example. Well, science says some phenomenon is taking place in the physical brain I can't quite explain, or I'm able to explain but only partially. So earlier the explanation was very simple. You have so many neurons which are sending out electrical signals, and the number of neurons is really huge. And all these electrical signals somehow in a complex interplay create for the awakening of your consciousness or mind. Somehow. And there's always this gap of a somehow. And the pursuit of neurobiology or neuropsychology or artificial intelligence, coming from a very different angle of computers, is precisely to find out how this somehow happens. And always we find we are able to imitate certain elements of intelligence, certain behavior of consciousness, but we fall short of something more essential which consciousness of the human being has, but your artificial intelligence does not have. Something always falls short. So we say in these fields of exploration that we have actually solved the problem, only we are limited by our capacity to replicate the brain's complexity. My computers are too slow, they don't have enough memory, or they are still too limited by the technology. That's what we've been saying for the last 40 years. And interestingly, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in the 1970s, early 70s, when a computer was the size of a big refrigerator and had less computing power than your ordinary cheapest mobile phone. In those days, they said, if we had to replicate the human brain to be able to produce the phenomenon of consciousness or mind, we would have to make a computer which would be as big as the moon. And that's why we can't replicate it, because it's just a technological problem of numbers. Now, as we have subsequently gone on, every 2 years, our computing power has doubled. So going back over 40 years, you can imagine how much the computing power has increased. And with that, at the same time, parallelly, our understanding of the brain's working has also increased. So with the complexity of our understanding of brain's working, we have come to a new conclusion, that the brain is so complex that with all the new computing power that we have, if we had to replicate the brain's appearance of consciousness or mind, the new computers with their faster capabilities would have to be as big as the moon. So somehow it seems the closer we get to an understanding of the phenomenon of consciousness, the more it seems to elude us, suggesting that perhaps it is not merely a product of brain processes. In fact, there are entire fields of psychological exploration and even parapsychological exploration which prove without doubt that the mind is not a product of the brain. The fact that you can project your mind beyond the brain or physical senses, project it at a distance on the other side of the earth, project it to other planets, see and experience things and describe them accurately, is proof that the mind is not a product of the brain, and the mind is fundamentally free of the brain. And just that would be enough to break down all the assumptions of current neuroscience. But in practice, because this is so damaging to the existing models, such phenomena, parapsychological phenomena, are kept aside. They are not considered mainstream science, even though they demonstrate their evidence using all the tools of mainstream science. Science itself is split into those who accept consciousness is independent and those who see consciousness merely as phenomena. This division is described as the hard problem. Hard in Americanese means difficult, not physically hard, but difficult. So it's the hard problem because it doesn't have a solution. All it ends up doing is it divides people into positions of belief. And I recall once when I was visiting a conference which was about artificial intelligence, an international conference in Hong Kong. We were in a dinner discussion with the speakers, and since I was new to their group, they didn't know me, they asked, "So, what is your position on the hard problem?" And obviously I stated, well, obviously consciousness is prior. Oh yeah. Immediately I was labeled and plugged into a group which was not common to that group. That's it. So you have really two positions, and this thoroughgoing materialism, while it may claim that all this is product of the brain and may seem to or attempt to explain it, fails. But that failure is not important. irrespective of what it may claim. It cannot ignore the fact that the phenomena of mind or consciousness is something so fundamentally different as to be not decomposable into merely processes of nature. It may still be produced by the process of nature, but you cannot see how it is produced. There seems to be some kind of a leap. So it cannot get rid of the practical fact of this duality. In practice, even if I made an artificial intelligence computer that pretends to have consciousness or mind, I will still have to recognize that the functioning of the mind is a thing that I have to deal with in itself and not merely as a product of processes of neurons. So now we have to face the truth of this duality. It does not matter at all how it came about. The fact is not only there, it determines our whole existence. It is the one fact which is really important to us as human beings with a will and an intelligence and a subjective existence which makes all our happiness and our suffering. So he is coming now to the crux. Forget your explanations. What is your subjective experience and how important is it? We cannot get rid of the fact that there is this duality, and it is the one thing which is really important as human beings, with a will and an intelligence and subjective existence. If you didn't have will, intelligence and subjective existence, it wouldn't matter. My computer is programmed to do what it has to do. A sophisticated artificial intelligence is still programmed to do what it has been programmed to do and will keep doing only that. I, on the other hand, have this experience of a conscious will. I believe I can exercise a choice. And then it becomes a critical factor. What is this part which is conscious and can exercise a choice? And against what is it struggling when it is trying to exercise the choice? I have an intelligence. And as an intelligence, I am able to look at processes of nature by standing back from them, being essentially free of them, and being able to transcend them to override and change. And this is what makes me human and makes my human life meaningful. If I did not have this ability, if I was merely a victim of all the nature's processes, then I would not be human. My essential humanity has this choice, this freedom, and it's important because my intelligence rests on utilizing this freedom and my willpower depends on this. And finally, the third aspect of it, I have an internal subjective life. It's not only what happens outside. People may be so nice to me, but internally I may be depressed. It's a very strange experience. Some of the most famous actresses or models commit suicide. They're successful, they're famous, everybody seems to adore them, they make lots of money, they're almost able to live anything that they want to do in their life because they have all the freedom and the money and friends and social life, and they commit suicide from depression. Why did they get depressed? You cannot understand this. But if you get inside their mind, you notice as they look out upon this world where they have all this adulation and comfort and wealth, they realize they are all alone. Nobody really loves them for who they are. They love them for their wealth or for the benefits they get or for the social interactions which are all so superficial as to not touch me. And suddenly you find yourself all alone and no hope ever of having any meaningful, deeper relation where I could be not alone. And you realize the subjective life which is internal, which others cannot see, is so cut off, so different, as to be almost the opposite of the objective part of the life. And in this subjective life, I can be happy or sad, completely separate from the objective part of my life. Objectively, I may have nothing, and yet subjectively, I may be happy. Somebody says there's this famous story of a man whose child has died, and he goes to the sage, please bring back my child's life. And the sage says, after much pressure, first he tries to explain to him, look, this is how it is, you have to accept, etc. But eventually, under pressure, the sage gives in and says, all right, I will do that if there's a condition. You must bring me something which will make it possible for me to do it. All right, tell me, I will go to the end of the world to bring my child back to life. You must go around the world and bring me the shirt worn by a man who is happy. So this is very easy. He goes around asking people, are you happy, happy, happy? And everybody who seems to be happy, who's wealthy, who's popular, says, you know what, I have all this, but inside I'm still unhappy. Eventually, after wandering all over the world, he finds one man sitting by the roadside. And he says, are you happy? And the man says, yes, I am utterly happy. And the fellow asks, please give me your shirt. And the man says, I'm sorry, I don't have one. He's a mendicant sitting on the banks of the river or the road or whatever it is, free of all possession and therefore all struggle associated with possession. So this is, of course, highlighting the ascetic life and the ascetic ideal. But the story itself is suggestive that in practice, nobody is truly happy. And to have true happiness internally does not require external means and comforts. The inner life, subjective life, and the objective outer life are so cut off they can be completely separate from each other. And this is the point we are looking at. In the human being, we have a subjective existence which makes all our happiness and our suffering. And somehow this subjective existence is dependent on who I am and what my relationship is with this nature, which is not I, against which I have to struggle. So all of this points to the fact that this question and the duality, this determines our whole existence. It is the one fact which is really important to us as human beings, with a will and an intelligence and a subjective existence which makes all our happiness and our suffering. So now we need to explore this problem. And the journey of exploration is going to be subjective. We're not looking at any philosophies. What do you experience in yourself? Can we reduce the volume slightly? Sri Aurobindo writes, the whole problem of life resolves itself into this one question. And now he will write the question in quotation marks. I will read the whole question and then we will look at all of its components. What are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face with each other? This nature, this personal and cosmic activity, which tries to impress itself upon the soul, to possess, control, determine it. And this soul, which feels that in some mysterious way it has a freedom, a control over itself, a responsibility for what it is and does, and tries therefore to turn upon nature, its own and the world's, and to control, possess, enjoy, or even, it may be, reject and escape from her. End quotation. So this is the big question. The way he formulates the question is, what are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face with each other? Question mark. This is the question itself. But within the question, he is describing all the component aspects of the question. After all, if you ask a fundamental question, the fundamental question cannot be so important unless it had many internal facets to it. So what are these facets? And again, it's purely a question of subjective introspection. So the first part of the question is, what are we to do with this soul and nature? They are there. Now what do I do? I can only know what I can do if I know what is their relationship and what is possible in that relationship. So now we go deeper into it. Set face to face with each other. They are facing each other as if each is pushing or attempting to dominate upon the other. They are face to face. If they were both facing the same direction, perhaps there would not be a problem. But since they are facing each other, each trying to do its thing, somehow ends up eating into the freedom of the other, eating into the territory of the other and its reality. And the moment this becomes active, it overwhelms the other. If that becomes active, it overwhelms this. They are facing each other. What do we do about it? Now we look deeper into the question. To be able to understand what to do about these two facing each other, we have to look at what they are each trying to do. So first he describes nature. This nature. This personal and cosmic activity. So nature with a capital N, he looks at two levels, personal and cosmic. In both cases it is the same activity. And the question now extends itself to both aspects, personal nature as well as cosmic nature. So when we now begin to look at examples, we will look at both. But essentially we will discover the personal nature and the cosmic nature are not really different. They are only different in scope. My personal nature is a part of cosmic nature, and somehow whatever issues I have with cosmic nature eventually find their way to be represented in my personal nature. Or, more interestingly, any issues I have with my personal nature eventually find their representation in the cosmic working, because they are really one or two aspects of the same one. So if I find in myself, in my nature there is a rigidity, then looking out into the cosmos, I discover that rigidity everywhere. If in my nature there is a narrowness, I look out and I find the same narrowness everywhere. Or equally, if I look out into the cosmos and I say, this world is a domain of suffering, I find in my nature also I am trapped in a bundle of suffering. Oh, this world is so exciting and fascinating, there's so many things to discover, and I look into my own nature and I say, my God, in my own nature there's so much to discover. It's a continuum, really. And yet, in the relationship of the two, there's a huge difference. When I begin to explore my own nature, the whole exploration is subjective. I find that every time that I eat this food, my energy levels are higher. But it doesn't apply to everybody. I find every time that I expose myself to these particular kinds of thoughts or emotions, I find myself depleted of energy. But it's not quite the same with others. For them, it's a different pattern. So there's a subjective element to this, and then there are common elements which are part of the objective. And the objective exploration is what we do when we try to dive into the ocean, observe the working of nature and the complexity and interdependence of the climate, explore outer space, etc. The exploration of inner space is fundamentally different subjectively as an experience. So we are looking at two facets of nature. One is personal nature and the other is cosmic activity, but commonly both are activity. So this nature, this personal and cosmic activity, which tries to impress itself upon the soul. And now we are looking at the relationship. What is this nature doing? Tries to impress itself upon the soul. And what are the nuances of this impressing? To possess, to control, determine it. Poor soul. Nature is always trying to somehow impress itself upon the soul. And on the other side, what happens with the soul? And this soul, which feels that in some mysterious way it has a freedom, a control over itself, a responsibility for what it is and does, and tries therefore to turn upon nature, its own nature and the world, and to control, possess, enjoy. Now, look at again the two movements. Nature wants to impress itself upon the soul, but the soul feels in some mysterious way it has a freedom and control over itself. So this is the first level of the struggle. Then we will look at the nuances of the struggle. In the first level, nature is trying to impress, and the soul feels it has control over itself and therefore does not want to be controlled by nature. Now observe this subjectively in yourself. What happens? You find circumstances of life are always putting a squeeze on you. I have to do so many things. If nothing else, I have to prepare food, I have to clean my space, I have to pay my taxes, I have to file certain papers, or all the complexities which are required so that I can continue to exist as a human being. And those complexities begin to creep into me. And then they begin to try to impress themselves on me. The world is not a very nice place. Everything is based on objectivity and a doubt. Nobody trusts anybody. And so within me, gradually, I learn to distrust. Living in a society where distrust is the norm. You go to the government's office and they say, I'm sorry, your name is not on your database. As far as we are concerned, you don't exist. I'm sorry, I cannot give you what you need. What do? Now you try to conform to the mechanism required. I must get myself into the database, for which I must file all these papers. And the papers ask you, when you apply for a visa, they ask you, have you ever committed a terrorist act? And you're supposed to say no. I don't think even a terrorist will actually say yes. And I ask myself always, why do they even bother to ask the question? But it's required for a legal reason. Because having said no, if they can prove that you actually committed a terrorist act, then you have broken the law by lying to the government, and now your visa can be withdrawn. You see how indirect the whole thing is. And somehow the machineries of society and the demands of those distrust systems become so complex that you end up at each step asking, but how do we ensure that this fellow does not steal? So you put a policeman on top of him. How do you ensure that the policeman does not abuse his powers? You put something else on top of him. And you build a whole superstructure which becomes suffocating, and all of this seeps into your thinking and your feelings and your life values. You are suffocating, trapped by life. And I'm giving only one aspect of the whole social life. So many other aspects we can all introspect, specific to our own domain of activity. Somehow nature is pushing upon us, impressing the environment on you. If you live in a forest with no other human beings to worry about, every animal greets you as you are. Some like you, some don't like you, some fear you, some are happy that you are present, but everybody is relating to you at the moment as you are. I don't need any pretenses. It's such a huge relief to be free. And at that point, I begin to behave differently. I somehow remove all these shackles that I have placed upon myself, and I become more transparent. If you notice in the way human beings live, in the look in their eyes, you will see this difference. In the city people, those who have grown up or have lived in the city for too long, you look into their eyes, you cannot see what they think or feel. They have learned to put up a front. They have become hypocritical. You go into the villages or people who live closer to nature, where these artificial standards are not imposed. You look into their eyes, you can see what they think, what they feel, what they are. You can see them, as if literally see their soul. They're transparent, they're not pretentious. So the pressure of nature is somehow warping you. And how? Impress upon the soul to possess, control, determine it. The movement of nature is literally possessing you, grabbing you and making you from inside out what it wants. Second, it controls you. Having possessed you from inside, it begins to control you. And third, it determines your identity and existence. The sequence is very important, because when you look at the other sequence of the soul's response, it turns upon nature and tries to control, possess and enjoy. Now we'll see the sequence why it is so important. There's a difference. First, nature is possessing, controlling and determining, and soul is controlling, possessing and enjoying. What is the difference between possessing and controlling? So we see the sequence is reversed between soul and nature. Nature first possesses you. Who am I? I am this body. I cannot say that I have a body to begin with. I am the body. I am my emotions. I am my thoughts. Nature has already invaded and possessed my identity. Take away my body, I won't exist. Take away my emotions or my thoughts, I won't exist. Nature possesses me completely. And having possessed, having become the substance of my existence, she then begins to control. I cannot help it, my body is unable to eat this food and digest it. My temperament of emotions is temperamentally trusting or distrusting. My way of thinking is by nature such or the other. So the control of my thoughts, emotions and lifestyle is coming from the very possession that nature has already made. And as a result, when I have a series of patterns which nature has controlled and formed, she has determined my identity. I am this bundle of habits of likes and dislikes. I cannot be otherwise. A determination is set. So you see, nature enters and seizes your material. From inside, the material itself, although flexible, puts up preferences. And those preferences eventually harden to determine your identity. Now if you have allowed this process to happen, I am nothing other than this toy created by nature. Modern science, because it has seen things from the nature's perspective and seen soul as a product of nature, in that extreme materialism, will therefore say that you are the product of your genes, of your environmental influences, of the food that you eat, and the conditioning which has been imprinted upon you. That is you. And if I can tweak these things, I can determine what you are. And the entire educational system of the industrial age was built on this idea. If we can tweak these processes of training, we can design a person to become a good citizen, or a soldier, or an inventor, or an artist, or whatever else, because it's finally raw material. As they went deeper into it, they discovered no, in each child there seems to be material which they cannot fully control, which seems to push back even in their attempt to control. And then they tied it to heredity. Oh, because your heredity makes you inclined this way, you behave that way. And so we have to work within the limitations of your heredity. And still, in spite of that, we discover in a family of certain hereditary types, one child which is completely different. And so rather than being able to explain it, we just dismiss it as, well, within hereditary there are uncontrolled phenomena which are freak, unexplainable. Basically saying we don't know. But something pops up which breaks this assumption. So if you give in to nature's processes, it seems as if everything could be predestined. But we discover there are things which do not give in to nature's processes and push back at all three levels. If nature is trying to possess you and becomes your material, you can change your material. Very physically, the food you eat. If the food you eat has a dulling effect and makes your body lazy, makes your mind and emotions dull and uncreative, you can change the type of food that you eat. And therefore change the way nature possesses you. And make yourself lighter, freer, and so on. In the same second level, when nature is controlling you, she pops up within you an urge. Suddenly, I feel like doing this. I find that out of the blue, I hate this experience. It happened to me at one point. Out of the blue, suddenly there was an intensified sensitivity to garlic. Out of the blue it came. I didn't know from where. Later I was able to trace back the tendencies also, but out of the blue it was so strong. If somebody opened a plate of food at the other end of the room, I would experience the smell of garlic as a physical impact and a shrinking of the body. It was so intense. It lasted for 2 or 3 years and then suddenly it faded out. Why? I don't know. Every child in their teenage will experience suddenly strong desires, strong passions, not only which drive their behavior but which cloud their thinking, make them irrational in their behavior. Where does it come from? Why does it kick in at that age? Why does it diminish after a certain age? We don't know. We say nature's procreative instinct. But who decided it? Who programmed it? Or who says now activate, now deactivate? Who gives to it this direction or that? Because it varies across people. And if I realize this is happening within me, I find that I can exercise my will to restrain. An impulse comes to get upset, I am able to restrain it. An impulse comes to desire, I can restrain it. So the second level which nature controls, I discover also that I can modify. Not only that, I can train a child that he can modify it more easily. From childhood, I make him conscious. Look, every time you have an impulse, you have a choice. You don't have to cave in. And if the child begins to observe it, he discovers a greater freedom. And nature's control can be reduced. And the third level, which is the determination of nature, similarly, I find I can make plastic. And this happens most easily in certain activities such as theatre. I have to put up an act to become different kinds of personality. And with each personality, I reshape my thinking, my emotions, my behavior. And on the dot, I can switch personality to become something totally different. Who am I really? It actually makes you question, if I can use personalities literally like a mask, I am none of these. I am the one who chooses to put on the mask or remove the mask. And it makes you go deeper to discover your own deeper determination. I am not my thoughts, emotions and behavior. I am something more deep. So, first side is nature trying to impress itself upon the soul to possess, control, determine it. On the other side, now we experience what the soul feels subjectively. Also, just to complete the discussion, if you imprint from outside on a person a pattern of behavior, you discover at some point the person rebels and pushes back. We thought we could determine the person's identity by an external programming, through education, through other means. Suddenly something happens and the person rejects, rebels and pushes back. Why? We don't understand. Or we say something was deficient in our programming, we need a more skillful programming. Even where people have been hypnotized and made to behave in strange ways. This is a very strange field of exploration which was developed initially during the Second World War and then extended into the United States through the transfer of the scientists who were involved in it, and became what was officially known as the MK Ultra. MK is short for mind control. And it was a program in which the military wanted to create a puppet person, reprogram a person so thoroughly that literally like a piece of software, you could make the person do whatever you wanted. To the degree that the person will not even know that they have been programmed, and they will do things without knowing that they are about to do it. And this became for them what they call the Manchurian candidate. The ideal assassin is somebody who doesn't know that he is going to assassinate. So you put somebody close to the person you want to assassinate, the person is perfectly aligned to the other fellows, your target's interests. They are embraced, they are accepted, and suddenly the programming kicks in and the person changes, flips personality, puts forward a will or an impulse and assassinates. and then switches back and they don't know what they did or why they did. This is of course what they call the ideal assassin or Manchurian candidate. Now what is interesting in this whole program was it was enormously successful. So successful that they had to bury it and take it behind the scenes so that people would not get too scared. But what is more interesting in the program was it was enormously successful on certain individuals, but it was a massive failure on other individuals. They were very quickly able to define the types of people who could be easily influenced and programmed, and identify those types who would not, who would rebel innately. And if you go to the core of the whole question of what differentiates the two, it was individuals in whom the deeper soul influence or soul aspiration, psychic being, had a stronger influence on the surface personality, could not be programmed or could not be programmed beyond a point after which the inner influence would push back. People in whom that influence was not strong, or the deeper individuality, not outer nature, the inner psychic individuality was not so formed, they could be programmed and made into robot-like in their behavior. Now, it has nothing to do with outer personality. Your outer personality could be very organized and disciplined with clear thinking, but if the inner being, the deeper identity is not sufficiently formed, such a person would be a perfect candidate. Because externally he is so organized and disciplined that he will execute perfectly the commands given internally. On the other hand, when the inner being is strong and active and individuality developed at the level of the psychic personality, then externally, whatever you may be, weak or strong in individuality, that would override any programming which was contrary to the psychic. So there were all kinds of experiments to first sift the two types and then to catch the types that they could program. Now what is important is, in the programming itself, you will notice the method they used was to create as much as possible a gap between the inner being and the outer nature. They found people who had passed through extreme trauma in childhood were the best candidates. Because during the moment of trauma, you are so intensely in distress in the external consciousness that your inner being pulls back to protect itself. And a gap is formed. And then you can interfere and manipulate and program the person. If you can trap the inner being so thoroughly that he has no more influence on the outer, you have your perfect candidate. Now you can see why. In the design of the educational system, there were attempts to harden the surface personality and to deny the deeper soul values, because it makes the citizen inherently malleable and controllable. Now all this is as far as nature can push until something inside pushes back. And that happens, you cannot determine the individual completely unless it was never there sufficiently developed to begin with. Now we turn to the other side, the experience from inside. What's happening? This soul, what to do with this soul, which feels that in some mysterious way it has a freedom. So this is the first character of your soul. And we are not speaking of the deepest, inmost soul, not the psychic being yet. Just you as a person who's conscious of your individuality. What do you discover? In some mysterious way you have a freedom. How does the freedom come? I don't know. But I feel I can choose. Choose now, make a choice between these two. Pick which flower you want. The red or the yellow. And make a free choice. Observe what's happening inside you when you make a free choice. You look at this, and you wait. And then either an impulse comes and you accept it, I've chose. Or you find several impulses rising. I like red, but because I'm predictable that I will choose red, therefore I now choose yellow. I made a free choice. You see? Or knowing that the other person knows I will deliberately, they know that I like red, they know that I will outthink them and choose yellow, and they will expect me to choose yellow, therefore I go with red. Free choice. Is it really free? And you could counter question and go through multiple layers of concealment to stand back to find your freedom. And still you could call it a programming of your thought. And if you were sufficiently predictable, someone could have said, you will do this. Strange. And yet, in spite of that, we feel instinctively, somehow I have this choice. That's why he says, in some mysterious way, it feels it has a freedom. But I don't know how, where does it come from? Is it really true even? But yet I feel it. So what we feel is, from inside a very subjective emergence of a feeling of freedom. But when we actually try to analyze the nature of the freedom, it's not quite clear where it is or how it is. I have mentioned before here an experiment which is done to observe this free process. So you wire up the brain and you tell the person, now choose freely between the yellow and red flower and push a button at the moment where you make the choice. So I look, this. Interestingly, we observe in the brain processes while you're making the choice or while you're waiting for the impulse which will choose, and an entire quarter second before, that is 250 milliseconds before you say this, in the brain you can see which one you're going to choose. So the result of this experiment is for a scientist to claim, that means you don't really have free will, because in your brain processes were active which made the choice before you became conscious. From a yogic perspective, we will say no. It just means that there are deeper layers at which the choice is made. And it's only when the choice comes to my surface self-awareness that I become conscious of the choice that I made. But it again raises the question, what are the influences on those layers? Are they really a choice? Or is it an illusion I have that somehow in some mysterious way I have a freedom? The next result of the sense of freedom though is a control over itself. Because I am free, I have an ability to control what happens within me, even if it is part of my nature. Even if it is an impulsion of external cosmic nature pushing on me to try to force me to do something, I have a control to modify it. Or at least I feel that. So if I have freedom, I have control over what? Myself. Because I am free over myself, not over nature. I can choose to be free. In the extreme cases during war, when a soldier has been captured and is put under extreme torture to release the secrets, what happens is this. Somewhere inside I feel I have the freedom to refuse to reveal the secrets. And although my entire body or mind is pushed to the brink to make me break down, because it feels as if nature has determined me, I still can exert the control over myself to refuse. How far can I refuse? In the training given, and this is often shown in movies of this type, in the training given to people who have to become now spies for their country, they are taken through experience of this breakdown. They are pushed and pushed until they break down. And some people can go so far that even their physical body is put through so much pain. But the training is not complete unless they made you break down once, so that you know what it's like to be broken down. And it's often a very painful rite of maturing, that you were tortured into doing something which you refused to do. And having gone through that, you realize how vulnerable also you are. But having experienced it, you know also the edge of that vulnerability and perhaps can protect yourself better the next time. But all of these are extreme cases which are useful for us to understand the nature of this relationship. So, in some mysterious way it has a freedom and a control over itself. And if it has a control, then the third implication is it has a responsibility for what it is and does. If I can control, then certainly I should not be a nasty person. I should not do something which is nasty because I have the freedom. If I was merely a product of my biological processes, then it doesn't matter. This is the line of discussion going on today in the legal field, where they have demonstrated that a particular gene makes you have a tendency for criminal activity. And this is used in the court of law to say, sorry, this criminal has the criminal gene and therefore you cannot blame him for his criminal activities. Very convenient position. It is convenient from outside when you want to justify the freedom of the criminal, but it is the reverse of your subjective experience that I may have any tendency, but I discover I have a freedom and a control over myself, and therefore I have a responsibility over who I am and what I do, both. And these two are different. I can choose who I am. What kind of a person are you? I gave this example a few weeks ago of the head of our laboratory in the ashram, and he shared with me his experience. At the age of 21, he was a college or university student. One day he got up and he said, nothing stops me from becoming happy. It's entirely my choice whether I'm happy or not. And he decided, I'll never be unhappy, I will always be happy. That's it. And he said for the rest of his life, he has always been happy, whatever the external circumstances. What happened? Something within him awoke, sufficiently free from all these imprints of nature, that it could recognize it is free to be what it chooses to be, and it wants to be a happy consciousness, soul, being, whatever name you give. You are happiness. Second impact of that would be, what do I do if I am happy? Then I will always do things which are commensurate or incompatible to my being a happy person. Or the reverse can happen. I choose to be unhappy. Not always consciously, but well, that's how it is. You chose, you accepted to be bound to that unhappiness, and to the extent that you became bound to it, nothing externally can prevent you from truly becoming happy, except for short durations. Whenever you will notice an illness in a person which follows this pattern, you start a new medicine, suddenly there is improvement, and then after a few weeks, the body stops responding. You start another medicine or another line of treatment, suddenly there's an improvement, and then again it comes back to what it was. And you can try with many lines of treatment. They're always temporary, they always over time fade and become less effective. Then you know the core problem is, at a psychological level, in the way the person has accepted to be in their identity. Because somehow then the freedom of what you are overrides nature's influence, which are what your external processes would do to heal you. And then you look inside and decide to change who you are. Not what you express, but who you are in yourself. It's a very interesting experience, and I would suggest this as an experiment. Try this. Become conscious of what you are as an awareness, as a quality of awareness. And then look at what can you do to improve this. Okay, I'm this nice, happy or semi-happy person, sensitive, perhaps a little reactive. Okay, what do I want to be? And feel in yourself the quality that you want to be until that quality grows enough to be you. And that's it. You are a different person as a consciousness. And you realize if you have this freedom and this control over yourself, you have a responsibility for what you are and a responsibility for what you do. And having had this responsibility, what do you do now? You push back against all the things which nature is pushing upon you. Nature wants to possess, control and determine you. You feel you have a freedom and you now begin to push back because of the responsibility which comes with that freedom and the control that it gives you. You turn upon nature and tries therefore to turn upon nature, its own and the world's, again 2 levels of influence. Change what my body is pushing on me, what my thoughts are pushing on me. Change also what society or the nature of the world is compelling me to do. And so you push back. And how does the pushback take place? To control, possess, enjoy. And even it may be reject and escape from her. So the reject and escape is like the complement of control, possess and enjoy, but it's an alternative also. Let's look at how these work and the sequence here. Control. You don't possess nature. Nature is much more than you. You are at best a point of awareness. What can you do? You can tweak, push back on things, minor control influences. Increasingly, as this control grows, you feel as if you are possessing. So look at your morning routine at home. What do you do from the point you wake up until you leave the house? That's your free choice. That's what you possess, or so it appears. What's it made of? So many elements of control. I choose to do this, then this, then this, then this, and so as a result I possess my home and my freedom at home. The moment I step out, I don't have the same freedom. I'm dependent on the bus, which may be late. I'm dependent on the rain, which may or may not come, and so on. You do not have the sense of possessing. But in your own personal space, you started with elements of control and built up the control to a degree that it felt as if you possessed it all entirely. So you'll notice this pattern takes place everywhere. First, in little things in your environment, you start controlling, and you build through that control a complex nest, if you may use the term. That nest is your personal, protected, free space. Often it becomes your home. In many cases it is not, because in your home you may have others who dominate or overwhelm, so it becomes your room. If it does not become your room, it becomes the space you have when you are in the bathroom alone. So I know many people who, just to get free of the pressure of family, they will spend more time in the bathroom just to be alone and have that relief. But that's your space where you have the control which gives you possession. But notice, if you have a strong vitality, if you have the power, you're basically pushing outward from this center. I control my business. I control my relationship with my friends. Person becomes powerful enough. I control how society acts. One of the politicians in the US recently declared that she would have liked to become the head of Facebook, because she said, then I can control what people think. You see, the instinct of the politician is somehow to reach out and control the populace, who can then vote you back to power because you control how they think. Or the conqueror, who wants to now dominate and rule over territories. And here he is measuring the space, not in terms of people, but in large lands which are conquered, and so on. But through control you grow into possession. Whereas the way nature works on you is the reverse. Nature first possesses you. She is already the material that forms you. And then from within that material, she controls you. You see, the reason why Sri Aurobindo reverses the sequence here. But why are we trying to control ourselves, our nature, or larger nature? To possess. And having possessed, what do you do with nature? Enjoy. The whole point of the exercise is to be able to enjoy. If I can grow the flower in my garden, I will have a perfumed garden which I can enjoy. If I can make my bed more comfortable, I can lie down and enjoy the comfort. If I can arrange my circumstances in this way, I can enjoy those circumstances. The goal always is to arrange nature or rearrange nature in a way that you can enjoy nature. Why is it we're trying to do that? It seems to be somewhere deep inside us, inherently the deep need to enjoy. And the need itself uses the fact that you have a freedom and the ability to control what you are and what you do. If I can, then obviously I will arrange the whole world in order to be able to enjoy it more, which would be perfect. If not for the fact that world pushes back, takes away my enjoyment. I built up my whole business, which made me feel the king of the world and such an important person, and suddenly the markets crashed and my business collapsed. And now I'm suffering. I cannot enjoy life anymore. I cannot enjoy my business. I cannot enjoy my possession, whatever it is. It was in Auroville. One of our friends had this experience. They used to live in one of the communities in what was then a kith hut, made of bamboo and coconut leaves, and all their possessions were inside. And one evening they came home. It was a young couple. They came home to find their house on fire. Everything had burnt down, and the only thing which survived, interestingly, were the books of Sri Aurobindo and their mother. They walked up first in shock, and they came. Fire was too far gone. There was no way to stop it. And then they burst out laughing. And they laughed and laughed and laughed. You think about the response. You could have sat down and cried. You sat down and laughed. It was a big joke. All the things we had built up, all the things we were so attached to, now suddenly, poof, just like that, gone unexpectedly. And then something remains, which is as if indicating to you, oh, this is more important. And they just burst out laughing. And it was possible because they had this relationship with nature, with the world, with their life circumstances, where they had already a deeper reference. If they didn't have that, if they were identified with their possessions and dependent on the possession to enjoy, then they would have cried. But always behind that there is an enjoyment. They even enjoyed the destruction or the dissolution of all their attachments in a different way perhaps. And of course they built up a house. It was more beautiful, more complete, more stable, more solid, etc. But somewhere you find this pushback taking place. And everything in your life depends on how you manage the pushback. Because always nature or life pushes back. There's a very interesting quotation from Sri Aurobindo in one of his letters. I do not have the exact text, but it goes something like this. The idea is this. He says it is one of the rules of life that eventually everything will disappoint you, will fail you. Everything and everyone will eventually disappoint you or fail you. I have so many friends, I feel secure, I'm happy. But eventually a time will come in life where you will find all your friends not there, or abandoned, or abandoning you, or turning away from you, or looking down at you, whatever form it takes. Or I have so many support systems which makes it possible for me to enjoy life. Well, there will come a time when all your support systems will fail. Nothing left to help you, support you. Nobody left to help you and support you. And at that point, Sri Aurobindo writes in that statement, he says, it is only the divine which can always give you that support unfailingly. And it's as if life brings you to this experience that when everything else fails, what do? You turn into yourself. You turn to some higher, deeper reality, which is your only support. And where is that? Right here, right now, everywhere, within me. It is me in some more essential way. It can never let me down. She, he can never let me down. Whatever way you relate to that reality. But this pushback from life will happen. If you're lucky, it will really push hard and force you to rebuild or build that personal relationship with the divine and the exclusive reliance on the divine, which can never fail you, which will never fail you. If you're lucky, you have that experience. If you're not lucky, then life will push back a little bit anyway and point you to that, but not force you into it. But when that happens and you find entirely life failing you, what is the reaction you may have? One of the responses people have is, this is a domain of suffering. Even if momentarily I am able to now survive this ordeal, eventually I will rebuild my support systems, I will be happy, but eventually I will be pushed back, and eventually there will always be an oscillation between happiness and sadness, pain, suffering, pleasure. it will always fluctuate. I cannot have a real freedom or a real beatitude unless I withdraw from this compulsion of life itself. And so comes the complementing side of the choice, or even it may be reject and escape from her. I therefore reject all these influences of nature, escape from it to find what? Something which is a free consciousness, not dependent on nature, in which I can always be whatever it is I want to be. The form of rejection and escape can take many degrees. You may say, I withdraw completely from life, go into some cave and minimize all my exposures. But still, as long as you have a body, your little nature follows you. And if you have a tendency to be unhappy, well, it will stay with you even if you're in your cave or you make your little garden of comfort. And so somewhere along the way you have to get free of even your own nature. Reject your body, emotions and mind and escape from them to be able to find your real freedom. And Sri Aurobindo is pointing to this also because it is one of the means by which humanity finds a way to discover their soul in essence free of nature. But still it's a relationship of nature, of rejection and escape. Nature continues exactly as it was. You have not extinguished nature. You may even close your eyes and get into that consciousness, but the moment you open the eyes, well, nature is back. What do you do with it? Even the most rigid ascetic eventually has to eat food. In some of the most ascetic traditions, when they withdraw like this, they even will not wear clothes and will walk bare, but will eat the minimum required and so on. But eventually you still have to eat something. Your biological functions are still there and dependence on them. So the relationship has been modified, but the reality of both is always present. So conclusion, we look at the big sentence. What are we to do with this soul and nature? Question mark. This is the big sentence. Into this, what are we to do with this soul and nature set face to face with each other? Into this it describes this nature, this personal and cosmic activity which tries to impress itself upon the soul to possess, control, determine it. And this soul which feels that in some mysterious way it has a freedom, a control over itself, a responsibility for what it is and does, and tries therefore to turn upon nature, its own and the world's, and to control, possess, enjoy, or even it may be reject and escape from her. But in all this description, what he has mapped out is all of the tendencies of this relationship of nature and soul. Now we touched upon this briefly last time. We realized that ultimately there is no way to separate the two, to have one of them only. You cannot just be soul, there will always be nature. You cannot just have nature, there will always be soul. So while you may separate them to the most extreme, you can never separate them beyond a point. They're always together. They're as if tied to each other. One cannot exist without the other. Just to elaborate on the idea, how do you have no nature without soul? You can have all the nature going on, and this is one of the questions of quantum physics. If you put a cat inside a box with a pill of poison, is the cat dead or alive? You could even ask, is the cat even existent when you cannot see it? Was it even put in the box? I don't know. It's only when I can see that I can know there is a cat, or I can enjoy the fact of cat, or the cat exists because I see. So nature cannot exist unless something is watching, seeing or enjoying the nature. It would be as good as non-existent. So in the Sankhya tradition, which does this analysis and separation of the two, it declares nature and soul to be always in a duality, never capable of joining, but always present one for the other. You remove soul, nature will cease to be because there is no one to observe or enjoy. You have nature, it means there is a soul which is observing or enjoying. You remove nature, soul cannot exist. without some sense of beingness, reference to itself. Or in some traditions will say soul can exist, nature is as if withdrawn into soul, ceases to be, perhaps. But when you open your eyes or when the rock hits your face, well, you realize nature is out there. You cannot pretend it doesn't exist. So at the end of the day, the two are always together, neither can exist without the other. So what are we to do with this soul and nature? This is the big question, which is the most important for the human being. In order to answer the question, which is going to be the rest of the discussion of the chapter, in order to answer that question, Sri Aurobindo writes, we have to know. Then he puts a dash. To know what the soul can do, to know what it can do with itself, to know too what it can do with nature and the world. But it's interesting, Sri Aurobindo doesn't say, in order to answer that question, we have to know what the soul can do and what it can do with nature. He first says, in order to answer that question, we have to know. Pause, dash. And he is elaborating what we have to know. But essentially, the problem is resolved only if we can begin to know. The more deeply we know, the more completely we know, the more we have the answer to this question, which is complete. In that knowing, there are three facets. The first facet is to know what the soul can do. Second, to know what it can do with itself. You see, there's a difference. To know what I can do and to know what I can do with myself. They're different things. And to know too what it can do with nature and the world. This is very subtle. Why Sri Aurobindo bothers to state these very subtle ideas. Each of these is an exploration in itself. And before we get into this, the value of this knowing, he says, the whole of human philosophy, religion, science is really nothing but an attempt to get at the right data upon which it will be possible to answer the question and solve as satisfactorily as our knowledge will allow the problem of our existence. Remember earlier we saw, he discussed how all the world's art, poetry and all the efforts to knowledge and the desire to enjoy and effort to act are pointing towards this highest divine experience. And now he's saying, with regard to this particular relationship of soul and nature, whole of human philosophy, religion and science is only an attempt to get at the right data upon which we can answer this question. Now these three fields of exploration which he has mentioned, philosophy, religion and science, are each approaching the same question but from a different angle. Science approaches it from a much more material and objective means. Philosophy observes it from a more rational and subjective means. Religion approaches it much more from the feeling of the heart's recognition and an intuition. The foundations on which these three approaches are based are different. And although they all three approach the same question, they therefore view it differently. But none of these three in itself can give you the complete understanding, because each has a limited starting point and bias of its starting point. But all three together can give you the most complete experience or knowledge, which would allow you, giving you the right data upon which it is possible to answer the question and solve as satisfactorily as our knowledge will allow the problem of our existence. If your knowledge is limited, you will have solved to that limitation. If your knowledge is complete, you will have solved it to that completeness. Well, the whole of the rest of the chapter is going to be about this. But in these three, which he has placed before, philosophy, religion and science, Sri Aurobindo has given an indication, a pointer to a deeper discussion. And maybe next time we will look at that deeper discussion. In one of the essays, Sri Aurobindo writes how these three fields of exploration of this question take turns in history. If you look at the journey of Western civilization, during the phase of the Greek culture, the question was approached from the angle of philosophy. Thinking objectively, rationally, thinking to figure out what's the whole answer to this problem of our existence. Later it gave way to a religious resolution, and the religion formulated it in terms which were irrational, but some elements of it which were more intuitive and emotional gave the heart some juice of satisfaction. And after that, in a reaction to the limitations and irrationality of religion, came science, which approached the whole thing objectively and rationally. While philosophy was subjective and rational, science became objective, rational, and reductionist to matter. It also attempted to answer this question, and to whatever extent it could, it did, until its failure became too evident. And what you see today is the breakdown of the satisfaction that science has given, and a turn again to something subjective, and a subjective resolution to the problem, which is described as postmodernism, where each one in what they feel is right in what they feel. Even if what you feel is different from what I feel and they collide in their formulation, I have to accept that you are right in your feeling irrespective of what I feel. And somewhere that's not satisfying either. If we continue in this path long enough, eventually we will have a dissatisfaction and a rejection of this and an attempt to get something else back, which will be either philosophy or religion. And you see today the resurgence of religious forms in many spaces, but now the religion has to satisfy the demand of science and rationality. It has to satisfy the philosophical foundation also, which is not forgotten. And so Sri Aurobindo says you move across these three. Again and again, one of these will dominate, the other two will subside, and then one of these will dominate. And the three together, assisting each other, make for the gradual evolutionary awakening of our knowledge and our deeper understanding and appreciation of the problem of our existence, as much as the knowledge grows, through these three facets of approach. So coming back to the line before, in order to answer that question, we have to know, very simply. And the knowing here is not thinking knowing, it is not just emotional or intuitive knowing, it is not just subjective introspection. It has to be a complete living experience. But as a mass, humanity is unable to make that leap, so there are these phases and different sides of earth sometimes push forward different facets, and mutually enriching each other, we grow as a collective. But an individual can rapidly dive deep and awaken to a deeper knowing. And perhaps even be able to articulate it in rational terms, in philosophical terms, and also have the satisfaction, the heart's experience and the intuitive fulfillment of that experience. What Sri Aurobindo will present for the rest of the chapter will satisfy all three, though he will not go deep into each of these three because it is too wide as a scope, but it's as if he draws all those discussions made in different spaces into this and puts together a framework which is philosophically consistent, which is scientifically valid, and at the same time satisfying to the heart's experience and the religious devotion. So in order to answer that question, we have to know completely. But the knowing has three facets. First facet, to know what the soul can do. And in this first level, he differentiates from to know what it can do with itself. Meaning he is looking at what the soul can do without consideration of application. What is this freedom? What is the soul actually capable of? Can it become aware? Can it know? Can it exercise a power? Can it change itself? Can it ask for a higher help? Is there anything else other than it which it can ask for help from? All of these will be part of the immediate discussion after. Knowing what the soul is capable of doing, now we look at the field of application. What can it do with itself and what it can do with nature and the world. How does this power of knowing, being, changing, turn to knowing and being and changing myself? How does it turn to knowing and being and changing my world? What is possible, what is not? Very clearly, everything is not possible. You cannot on a whim change the whole universe by wishing it. It doesn't work. You can try very hard. There are even very seductive teachings which will tell you, if you really wish hard enough, it will happen somehow. The whole universe will bend backwards and forward to make it happen. Doesn't really work out. You cannot ask for something which is extraordinary to happen and it would happen. On the other hand, we do find occasionally, without even intending it, something extraordinary happens just like that, and we say, it's a miracle. I couldn't even have asked for it, and it is something so perfect, and it happened and solved all my problems. So there is some mechanism which is secret, which is hidden, of which I don't have a full understanding. Somehow the fact that I needed it, even without my attempting, made for that to happen. On the other hand, I attempted so hard to make something happen, and it didn't happen. So what can you do with nature and the world, and then what can you do with yourself in terms of changing yourself? All goes back to the first knowledge of what is the soul capable of doing. And knowing, in more essence, will be simply knowing your soul entirely, in which you will know what it can do with itself, what it can do with nature and the world. So you see the sentence. In order to answer that question, we have to know. To know what the soul can do, to know what it can do with itself, to know too what it can do with nature and the world. But on what basis will we be able to know? Well, that's where he says the attempt of human philosophy, religion and science is really nothing but an attempt to get at the right data upon which it will be possible to answer the question. They will not give you the answer. They will only give you the data upon which you will answer, because the answer is not what you believe, it is what you experience. Based on the right data, you will be able to get to that experience of the right relationship of who you are and your relationship with yourself and nature. So the philosophy tells you, your soul is like this, your nature is like this is how it works. Okay, this allows me now to become conscious and know. Or science tells you, you are a product of your brain process. So now I know how I should set myself and what I can do. Or religion says, no, you were put out by God, and God decides who you are and what you do. So now I know what I can do. All they have provided is right data. They don't give you the answer, because the answer is not in understanding, it is in experience. With the right data, it will be possible to answer the question and solve as satisfactorily as knowledge will allow the problem of our existence. And this phrase, solve the problem of our existence, meaning it's a mystery which needs to be solved. The bulk of the problem of our existence and our existence itself is hidden. Because it is hidden, we have to somehow discover. And only when we have discovered completely that we will have the capacity to solve the mystery. And then we will know, this is what it was from the beginning. This is what it is doing now. This is where it is going. Now Sri Aurobindo sets the basis for this solution. The next paragraph. The hope of a complete escape from our present strife with a subjection to our lower and troubled nature and existence arises when we perceive what religion and philosophy affirm, but modern thought has tried to deny, that there are two poises of our soul existence, a lower troubled and subjected, a higher supreme untroubled and sovereign, one vibrant in mind and the other tranquil in spirit. Now he's turning to the data that philosophy, religion and science are giving to us. And the data has to be eventually the same for all three. But at the moment, at least, it seems as if the Religion and philosophy give you this data, that there is a lower existence and a higher existence. And in the lower existence, we are subjected, we are troubled, and in the higher, we are sovereign and untroubled. So religion tells you that by saying, oh yeah, there is a deeper soul and a higher truth and a spiritual consciousness and an inferior mental consciousness. Philosophy similarly tells you that there is a poise in which you can stand back, you can be free, you can have all that you want, but there's a poise where you're entangled and you're bound, and there are two poises. But science, he says, but modern thought has tried to deny. It's very interesting, his phrasing, very precise. Tried to deny in the face of evidence to the contrary. You can keep saying, no, it's not true. There is only one experience. There is only one state of consciousness, because consciousness is a product of your brain. You can keep saying it, but the evidence is sometimes so strong that your denial loses force. And you have to literally pretend not to see the evidence. And I gave the example earlier today of experiments of remote viewing or projection of consciousness well beyond the range of the body. You experience, you see things. I still remember reading some books written by the early military practitioners in the US of the remote viewing program. So they were selected in a program that the CIA developed for spying. They were selected from the military because of certain proclivities or tendencies for the remote viewing program, and they were taken into it, and they were warned at the beginning. This is very interesting. The head of the training program would say, be very careful. Think twice before you're going to join the program. Once you join the program, you will change so much. All your values will change, your whole experience of reality will change, your perception of who you are will change to such a degree that sometimes marriages have broken. Are you ready for it? And as it turned out, many entered the program and went through such a revolution of their sense of I that everything changed in their life. And it's fascinating to read some of these descriptions because they come from some of the most hard nuts in the military, who were trained to be as materialist as possible in their planning, strategy and beliefs of the world, and yet they discovered experiences where all of that was put to question and they had to struggle through. And they developed their own vocabulary to describe things of the world, what we would call the Brahman consciousness. They began to refer to as the matrix. Somehow the matrix knows where you want to go and what you want to do, and it takes you there. Who is this matrix? No, we don't question it. No philosophy, we just apply it. One of the things which would happen, and this is an example given by one of them, he says they were being taken into an experience out of a projection of consciousness to some locations. And the location was done always by numbers, some arbitrary 8-digit number. So the person will read out a number, 2568-5121. And immediately your mind is pulled into a certain place. How does you or your inner being know where to go based on a number? And even the fellow who's reading out the number doesn't know, because the number is written on an envelope. Inside the envelope is a photo which he doesn't know. You read out the number and your consciousness is somehow projected right there. What knows what the photo is, where that photo is from, and how to get to that place? We don't know. Okay, they get there. So in one of the experiences, they had trouble getting there. So the fellow says, their instructor tells, okay, now we're going to do it again. This time I will help you. So they again find themselves projected. They feel cold, they feel heavy, they feel an enormous pressure, and they're a bit disoriented. And then this writer says, and then far off in the distance, I saw the instructor waving a beam of light, and I was shocked. And he finds himself then projected in the Titanic, and the instructor is standing on the Titanic calling them, and he comes back to his body with shock, and he says, what just happened? Because nothing in his experience ever told him that his mind was capable of not only projecting, but the other fellow was capable of projecting himself, and you were able to see him. It changes your sense of reality. It means all of us are not body. We are first of all spirit, or subtle body, whatever name you may give to it, which can actually go out there and meet, interact, and come back with full recollection of what we experienced. And to that person who had lived in the material scientific experience and belief for so long, it was a shock. To the person coming from a religious background or a philosophical background, they'll say, oh yeah, that makes sense, that's what we have always concluded or believed in. But science, in a very materialistic experiment done in the lab with all your tests, equipment confirming it, is demonstrating the same truth. But because it goes so far against the belief system that science pretends not to see. That's why Sri Aurobindo writes, modern thought has tried to deny, but fails obviously in the face of evidence. So, what does it show? There are two poises of our soul existence. When we say I exist, I am soul, there is a lower and a higher. The lower is bound in mind and subjected and troubled, and the other is in spirit, tranquil, untroubled, sovereign. It can choose, it has full freedom. And this gives you the hope that we can escape from our present strife and subjection to this conflicted state of nature and soul. And then he shows what are the further implications of this idea and where this logic takes us, which we will take for further exploration next Friday. For now, we have made a first big step in our exploration subjectively. We have begun to observe internally what are the two poises of our nature and our soul, how the two are each vying for control of each other and why, what are the deeper motives behind that, and the resolution to this requires us to be able to know more deeply. And we have seen how the data has to be reliable, upon which this deeper knowing can be then had. And now we are looking at that data through the lens of philosophy, religion, and science as best as they can provide supportive, useful data. All of this will take us through a deeper understanding of the relationship of soul and nature and of their true being. And we will discover eventually that both are expressions of the Satchidananda, and therefore this duality will resolve itself into the underlying oneness which was discussed earlier. Now, once this resolution takes place, this is the logic of the whole discussion, once this resolution takes place, you are then able to perceive all things in nature and glimpse the underlying absolute and infinity, while still not losing sight of the superficial form and limits. And then you are able to enjoy and experience everything as expression of Satchidananda, and then live in complete delight in God's world and complete satisfaction of mind, heart and will, while still being in a complete liberation of consciousness. Everything is coming back to that experience which we have to get to. But we are looking at first the principles on which this whole universe is formed, and in each principle we are discovering the underlying oneness, and through that it's as if we awaken to this experience which is our destiny eventually. That's the big picture we step back to. And we can pause here for any comments or questions. It's fascinating, isn't it? And he leads you in an introspection while still filling you with the best that past philosophies and religions have given to us.
I have a doubt actually.
Yes.
When we speak about religion, like what, for me religion is something, again it's subjective, for me religion is something that you do on a regular basis. So how is that integrated as one subject and how Sri Aurobindo talking about
Okay.
it?
You see, in history, you will find various religious traditions developing their subjective experience into an entire framework. And the framework includes certain beliefs, certain practices, and almost defines your life and priorities. The particular form of the religion is not at this point touched, which he will also touch later on. What the various beliefs are and how they really point to a common principle behind. But what we mean by religion is this large body of knowledge, practice, which is based almost entirely on some subjective experience or faith or intuition. It may not always have a philosophical formulation, it may not always have a scientific or rational validity. And that's why you can have religions fighting over their beliefs, while still holding on to some essential experience which justifies them. Mm-hmm.
is something that we do on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
That is very religious.
Yes. But in the religion, you do some things as a practice. But the basis of the practice is a certain conviction of experience or a belief transmitted to you by the religion itself. So, for example, in the Middle Ages in Europe, the religion said that you are a soul which has fallen because of the sins of somebody, and there is somebody else who came and took away your sins, but only on condition that you accept him. In order to accept him, you have to follow his representative, which is the church and the Pope. There's a whole mechanism around it. But behind that was a deep experience on the basis that, yes, we have a higher consciousness, a higher life, a heaven from which we seem to have fallen, and we are unable to somehow get back. We feel ourselves trapped. And around that basic experience, and that there is something which can help us, around that basic experience, a whole formulation is made. Now you can discount all of the particular form of it and still capture an essential principle behind, which also may be incomplete. There may be other factors which are ignored. But it is this which gave people the faith. So they knew, if we do good, if we serve, if we sing the praise of God, somehow we feel uplifted, somehow we feel brighter, more happy. And that was the validation of their experience. Even if the rest of the machinery was not rational or logical, there are a lot of internal contradictions to the whole story which is presented. And the same way you will have various forms of religion where this idea that there is something which is a higher consciousness and higher life to which you have to climb is implied. And the practices given to you are really the means by which you are supposed to make that ascent. Redeem, or whatever term you use to shift the consciousness. If not for that belief or that experience, the practice would have no value. Every morning you should get up and pray. For what? Because of prayer this will happen, that will happen, this will change, etc. Then it makes sense. But the philosophy doesn't talk of all that. It talks more of why things are the way they are. So you can see how the three are complementary. The religion may have a philosophical component, or the philosophy may lead to a religious formulation, but they would still be different in how they are viewed and the form in which you align yourself to. A philosopher is often satisfied with understanding without needing to practice.
Just adding to this, conversation, I think we all are evolved into being expressive beings, and we're constantly finding different ways and mediums to express the same thing. The same thing. The root and the final thing is constantly trying to express.
Is that your experience though? That's what you have been told, you believe. That's what the philosophy tells you. So if those who couldn't hear, she says, we're all trying to express the same thing. And so I asked, how do you know it's the same thing? Because each one is expressing different things. But we have been told by the philosophy that it is all going back to the same thing, isn't it? But you don't experience it, do you?
I do experience it.
Okay.
I feel everyone is constantly trying to liberate in some way or another.
Okay.
So they're trying to find different mediums in which they can liberate. And as you said, it can be materialistic or it can be inside. But the names that we use, science, spiritual science, philosophy, and religion, they have just evolved to find different expressions to express the same thing.
Okay, I understand what you mean by same thing here. We're all trying to solve the same problem or find the same resolution to it. In that sense, the same thing. But if you look at each person subjectively, what I am trying to express in my life is totally different from what you're trying to express in your life, isn't it? Although they point to ultimately, yes. But the perception that it's pointing to the same thing is coming more from the thought and the philosophy, or the religious belief that says ultimately everything comes from the same source and expresses the same truth. Okay, but I don't experience it in myself. Right now, I find myself and my expression in collision with your expression because, practically I find a difference. You see? So, if you observe very subjectively, it's not obvious that it's the same thing. If you go deep enough, then yes, it points to the same thing. But is it true? Until you verify in your experience all the way to the source, you cannot be sure. Okay, so implied in our thinking for all of us is, and because we are already oriented that way, every religion, when it leads to some realization of God, must end up with the same experience of God. Yeah, it's obvious, right? But is it true? How would we know unless we actually did it? And that's what Ramakrishna Paramahansa did. And the fact that it was done by one person in one lifetime while in the same body and mind, leading to the same experience and then confirming, yes, the divine I found was the same through each of these systems, that was necessary to give completeness to what would otherwise be only an idea or a hope even, or a logical possibility but not always verified. You see? Yes.
Practically,
Yes.
science is failing to get to that point, and it's not getting to the point, and everybody believes in science more than anything else, and that was because science and spirituality was very much in sync
Yes.
in the very beginning of the age.
Yes.
It was very
Yes.
in sync, and it took a drift when Jesus, for example, Jesus Christ being crucified. Because when anyone who would speak about spirituality or existence of that ultimate thing, it was simply eradicated, and people with the...
So it's not always true that science and spirituality were always one in the beginning, because inherently their starting points are different. So if the religion emerges from some subjective or intuitive experience, it need not always be rationally consistent. And there are ages in which that is the thing. The way today you say, everybody believes in science. It's still a belief, okay? In which you're still relying upon some elite who have verified that belief. Now to say that all matter is energy and and energy is matter with E equals mc square, is it true? Have you verified? No. You're trusting somebody who claims he has verified by a mechanism which is objective enough that if you were able to enter into it and verify, then you could confirm. But you cannot because you don't have the maths. Okay? Same thing happened during religion, where the religious leaders said, we have access to this, you trust us, and we are giving you this assurance. Of course it is misused. Even the science is misused. There are, between scientists, belief systems which are in conflict. And so, whom do you trust? And then you belong to this school and somebody belongs to that school of science. You end up with the same issue. Eventually, because common man does not have access to the experience, we have to rely on somebody who claims access to the experience and who give you some kind of validation which to you was satisfying enough. But perhaps if you went deep enough, you might find some flaws in it. We don't know. So science today is the king because it offered objectivity at a time when objectivity had been completely suppressed. But before that, when objectivity was not important, it was religion which was king. At a time when philosophy had become meaningless and dry thought, leading to no meaningful experience, and religion came to fill that gap. Now today we're seeing a similar passage of transition where science has led to a helplessness in the face of the problems of humanity. And it does not satisfy the heart. And where you have discussions of the scientific beliefs, there are people who say, yes, but this is all blah blah of the mind, I don't feel anything, I'm unhappy with it. And there's a shift to a subjective something which will make you feel, etc., etc. But fortunately, because at this point, unlike the past, the whole earth is pulled together. In the past, you could have a pocket of philosophy, pocket of religion, pocket of science, and therefore exist completely separate. Today, you cannot have one dominant thing without it colliding with the other, because the whole world is held together with one web of consciousness. And so the attempt to get free of the limitations of science through religion or philosophy is constantly colliding with science. And so it is compelling on religion to become rational. It's compelling philosophy to be verifiable objectively, while religion and philosophy are compelling science to go beyond its physical limits and to recognize a deeper reality. And between the three, if we allow a unification of the three principles, we might just make a breakthrough as a collective. And that's the hope. Yoga is the knowledge which has a scientific basis, it is validable, verifiable objectively. It has a philosophical component because it gives rise to an understanding of the nature of reality, which it promises you the means to verify, and it has also a completely rational and scientific validation, and it has also the religious satisfaction of the heart's experience of the divine. And so it is the one gift which is now being given to humanity as a way of making this breakthrough. We are at a stage in evolution where we do not have a few thousand years to experiment and waffle around wandering. If we do not make this transition soon enough, the entire system will collapse. Life itself on earth will collapse because of what's being done to it. And so there's an urgency and a need for this ascent to take place, and the means for that ascent have been given. Tools which are verifiable, objective, scientific, philosophical and religious in their completeness for what they can offer. Will humanity make that change? That is the challenge before us. Mm-hmm. Yes, so religion rests on a subjective and intuitive experience of the heart. So these are distinctions which cease to matter. When you approach the question from an experiential point of view, what is the nature of the religion and whether the religion is more theological or metaphysical is secondary. Because what we are looking at is between the three there is a completeness. And what we seek in our experience is something which satisfies all these. We are no more satisfied with a narrow framework of religion either. You see? So the days when you could speak of this religion versus that, and I choose this and you choose that, have passed because nobody wants to stay bound in a little box. Literally what religions became was a box of thought. You're locked into a box, and if you don't belong to the box with the others, well, you're in a separate box. Even the definition of religion was so perverted. If you look it up today, in most of the discussions, scholarly discussions, religion, the root goes back to religare, tying together, and so they describe it as that which binds us together. When in fact the original sense of that which connects you to the divine. It is the same as yoga, union with the divine. It was that concept which then has become groupism, forming groups. And you'll see in the younger minds, nobody wants to be locked up in a group. Everybody wants a universality of understanding, of approach. And so these distinctions have become meaningless. They remain only as studies in philosophy and thought. But for a practice, everybody wants to have the full satisfaction of all mind, heart, and life. Isn't it? So next time we will look at this, the first step to the resolution of the problem. There is a higher working of the soul and a lower existence of the soul. And between these two, we recognize we have also two relationships with nature. From the higher status, the soul has a different relationship with nature. From a lower status, the soul has a different relationship with nature. And this will then lead to a deeper understanding of that relationship and the means now to solve the problem of existence. We'll continue this Friday next.